Okay, then, thank you for moving a little bit closer, at least. And I think we can begin and start today's panel. It's my greatest pleasure to introduce to you Ms. Barkha Dutt, one of India's best-known journalists and the founding editor of Mojo Story, a multimedia platform. She's also a columnist for the Washington Post, and during her 25 years of reporting, she has been honored with several awards for her ground-based investigation. It's a pleasure to have you on the panel, Medad.
Thank you.
Secondly, I would like to introduce Mr. Christoph Plate, a journalist by training, who, after many years of working for various German-speaking newspapers in Africa, the Middle East, and also in Germany, is now the director of the media program Sub-Sahara Africa for the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. He brings together stakeholders in the media industry on a variety of topics in his daily work. And of course, last but not least, I would like to introduce to you Mr. Mahfouz Anam, who is the editor-publisher of The Daily Star, the highest-selling English newspaper in Bangladesh. He also has many years of working experience for the UNESCO and was part of his country's liberation war in 1971, before he then started his journalism career 1 year later. Welcome to our distinguished panelists. So what's happening next? In the 18 minutes that we have on this panel, we will discuss the credibility crisis of media institutions and how trust in the media can be restored. And I would like to start with a quote by the renowned Nigerian writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Back in 2009, she spoke about what she calls the danger of a single story, and how what we read and what we hear informs our perception of people and places. She says the single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they're untrue, but they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. And I don't want to go too much into detail into storytelling, because I know that there was just a panel right before lunch that was discussing this. So why am I mentioning this? Because I believe that there are two aspects to the single story. Firstly, what are the topics that are reported on, and how many viewpoints of the same story are produced by the media? And secondly, there's that is why I wanted to make the point, because these three distinguished panelists today are in the powerful position to shape the discourse and also to ensure that there are no single stories. And secondly, on the receiving end, we have consumers of media content like ourselves who can choose what to read and what to believe, and hence decide whether they want to believe a single story or not. And against this backdrop, it is especially exciting to have different perspectives on this panel today from different countries, from different continents, and different professions. And we are going to discuss how we can restore trust in the media, and also how media can encourage users to look beyond what they already think is true. And with this little introduction, I would like to invite Ms. Dutt for her opening remarks. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I have some images from what I've been up to in the last 2 years, which we'll go through in just a moment. But first, a little bit about myself for those who didn't attend the previous session. I spent more than 2 decades in television in mainstream media, and then at one point, much like large sections of our audience, got disillusioned with what was happening in television news, at least in the Indian context, and left it to become an independent media entrepreneur and run a multimedia platform called Mojo Story. Mojo is not mobile journalism as people think, but Mojo means magic. It's to discover or rediscover my own mojo, and also the aim was, how do you get your audience to re-engage at a time of high cynicism with media again? Wherever I would go, I would find, and I suspect this is a global phenomenon, people had lost respect for news media. Some of this is our fault, and some of this is not our fault, because the media is also reflecting an increasingly polarized environment around us, where, and I always make a joke about this, if I don't confirm the bias of my audience at one point on one issue or the other, they will call me biased. The day I'm confirming their bias, I'm suddenly their favorite journalist. So a little bit of it is the nature of politics all around us in our countries, but a little bit of it, at least in the Indian context I can speak of, is we stopped telling the stories of people. I always say to journalists that the biggest fault we had is that too often journalists do stories for other journalists. You know, you're commenting and writing and reporting for peer approval to outperform your competition. The issues that you talk about are almost sort of this navel-gazing universe where journalists and the power establishment may care about issues that are very far from the lives of ordinary people. For me, I quit television and started this digital startup at the end of 2019. And it was pure coincidence that 2 months later, we were looking at COVID. And I built Mojo Story on the back of 2 years of ground reporting. We had a very, very strict lockdown in India, and there was no public transport open. So the only way for me in the first wave to tell the stories of the people was to actually be on the road with them. And what do I mean by on the road with them? Some of you may not be familiar with what happened in India. We, other than the medical challenges of COVID and the shortage of hospital beds, the shortage of oxygen, the shortage of doctors, we had an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. Our poorest workers who lived on daily wages, who had sustenance wages, who lived in the cities but had homes in the villages, when the lockdown happened and all economic activity came to a halt, they lost all their source of income. They also lost a place to stay because they didn't have money to pay rent. A lot of them used to live on construction sites, in makeshift arrangements. And then, like everybody else, it wasn't just finances. They wanted to be with the people they loved. It felt like the end of the world. And like you and me, they too wanted to be home. And because there was no public transport, they began to walk home. Men, women, little children began to walk home, often walking 700, 800 kilometers or more, often, mostly without food, sometimes without water. And this became the story to report, except that nobody was reporting it. Nobody was reporting it because people weren't stepping out of the confines, in big media newsrooms at least, of their studios or their homes. Most offices, if you remember, had moved to homes. People were working from home. And I bring this up because I found, through this travel of mine, a rediscovery of what it means to be a journalist. And in this rediscovery, I also found what it actually takes to build trust or to rebuild trust with your audience. And the first thing I discovered is that, I've been a war correspondent and a political journalist. In the hierarchy of newsrooms, there were a lot of social issues that I would never cover because in the hierarchy of newsrooms, they were considered soft. And I was a woman, I wanted to prove myself, I wanted to be a hard news reporter. And a lot of these issues were just invisible. What really mattered to people: school, education, economy, the quality of water, the quality of air. Strangely, these issues were considered lower down in newsroom hierarchies than other issues like who's going to form the next government, or are India and Pakistan going to go to war, or so on. And so through these travels, I'll just show you a few pictures. I've got my eye on the time as well. I just want to give you a sense of what these 2 years taught me about rebuilding credibility and trust. So like I said, these are the kind of images you saw on India's highways, right? And this became my life in the first year of the first wave, just literally walking with these laborers as they walked. And I often say their universes were packed into one little sack above, which they would carry, and they would also carry their infant toddlers with them. And this kind of became my life. And I had a very intriguing challenge because most of my audience was upper middle class, English-speaking people, and I was reporting on extremely poor, non-English speaking people. And I had to find a way to make this tragedy relevant to my audience. So I'm just going to go through these pictures very quickly. We had instances of workers being locked up in factories. We had workers who would try and leave and would leave the borders to get home, and they would be beaten up by the police and sent right back. And sometimes I would find that people would just hold on to me and weep. And you can see that happening. This lady's name is Seema, and she was married to a rag picker. She had 3 children, abjectly poor, had no money to feed her children. And she would keep trying to leave the city to walk to her village. But by this time, the government had got very panicked about this exodus, which was the largest mass movement of people in India since the partition of our country in 1947. And because the government had got very panicked, they would keep trying to push these people back, but these people had nowhere back to go to because they didn't have a way to earn or eat. And I found, there was supposed to be social distancing, but for me it went out of the window because I had really vulnerable people looking to me for help. And I suddenly felt helpless and vulnerable in a way that I don't remember feeling for many years, and it reminded me, this image reminds me, this is what I became a journalist for. And somewhere along the way, I think we all forgot this. We forgot that we became journalists to give voice to those who do not have a voice. We forgot that we became journalists to be the bridge between what people want to say to their governments and aren't getting access to say. We forgot that we were obliged to be the voice of the people. This lady, her husband, sold the only asset he owned, which was a mobile phone. He sold it for a paltry 2,000 rupees. It was very hot in Delhi in those days, the Indian capital. He bought a table fan and some wheat and rice for his children to eat. And his wife, Poonam, whose picture you see, he was a painter. He used to paint at construction sites for daily wages. At first, she thought maybe the worst is over, some money has come, we'll be able to tide over the next few days. But the next morning, he took her sari, the cloth that you see her wearing, tied it to the bamboo pole that held up their one-room tenement and took his own life. And there was literally nobody to tell these stories. And even somebody like me, you see here are these workers, they're walking, they would walk through the night, they would walk through jungles, they would carry all their belongings, and sometimes they would pack themselves into the backs of trucks illegally that were supplying oil or other essential items, and they would just hope for some sort of reprieve. And this image touched me enormously. I asked them, I said, what happens when you leave? What is it that you carry with you? Just think, if you were leaving and you didn't know if you were coming back, what is it that you carry with you? And the workers, the laborers, were all carrying their workman tools because they were still hoping to earn a living. And I found this moment extraordinarily humbling in the way that it reminded me that we had moved so far away from telling the stories of people who live on the margins. Finally, because the clock is ticking, this child, he was 9 years old, and I said to him playfully, do you know what coronavirus is? And he said, yes. And I said, what is it? And he said, it means I don't get food. So this was a poor little child's understanding at a very basic level of what the pandemic meant. To sum up, and I'm sure more thoughts can come up in the question and answers, I, who had been kind of distant from these kind of social issues, because I was chasing the story that in the conventional mainstream news hierarchy is considered the hard news, suddenly had this wake-up call while reporting COVID, that there had been huge gap between what people care about and what we actually give primetime space to. And so I had to, after 23 years, unlearn some of the things I'd learned and recommit Mojo Story to being always a platform that would try and transcend the noise of electoral politics, because too often what really concerns people on an everyday basis gets locked into a vicious cycle of which party are you supporting, which party are you against. and focus singularly on people, on women, on the poor, on religious minorities, on displaced communities. It doesn't mean that I've given up the other things I used to cover, but in terms of the space, if this used to get 10% of what I used to do, I think now it gets about 60% or 70%, and the 30% is for the other issues. So I shared all this with you just to conclude by saying in my opening remarks that the only way we can rebuild trust is if we step out of our echo chambers, we step out of our navel-gazing universes, we stop doing news for each other or for the powerful, and find a way to have on our platforms issues that reflect what people talk about when they eat dinner at night. That gap is still very wide. What people talk about on an everyday basis is not what their news is talking about. Thank you.
That's definitely worth an applause. Thank you so much, Ms. Dutt, for the intriguing presentation and also on reporting on those COVID-related issues other than infection numbers, because not only in India, but I think around the world, it's just not reported on enough and not reflected on enough. And before we go into a much more deeper question and answer session afterwards, I would like to invite Mr. Plate now to give his remarks as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alina, for having me here on the panel. From my experience as a journalist of almost 30 years who has been working on the African continent and for 10 years in the Middle East, and since 5 years for the media program of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Johannesburg, I'd like to share a few observations and thoughts with you in the next couple of minutes, because we have been thinking a lot about the credibility crisis. And we have also observed that a lot of the problems in the credibility crisis are not necessarily homemade. I will speak in a few minutes about the homemade problems, but a lot of them are also problems of finance and problems of resources. When we organize conferences on the credibility crisis on the African continent, we observe a lot of these financial challenges. And one of the biggest challenges is that, unlike in the 1990s, when many media houses on the African continent were front runners for multi-party democracy, for investigating crimes of maybe dictatorial regimes that had been ruling before then, there was a lot of passion amongst media consumers and amongst advertisers to support these media houses. With the advent of social media, with the advent of the internet, we all are aware that a lot of the advertisement has moved into the online spaces. And the online space is not necessarily the online space that is being provided by media houses, but it's the online space which is being provided by financial companies and others who then can run the advertisements. The consequence of that is, of course, that a lot of the experienced people in newsrooms have moved on to greener pastures. They took up jobs with the United Nations. They took up jobs maybe with NGOs. They could not stand the political pressure anymore. And at the end of the day, they had to feed their children and send them to a good school. The pay for many of these senior editors in newsrooms was not comparable to the pay they would get in other parts of the private sector. So that you have an experienced gray-haired reporter and journalist and editor from Bangladesh who still does his work with passion is the exception worldwide. And I can also say so for the African continent. What's the result of that? We don't have gray-haired experienced people in the newsrooms anymore who the younger reporters and copywriters can turn to and can say, how was that at the election 20 years ago? How did you handle this crisis when the the head of the office of the president called and said, you are not going to run that news. How do you deal with that today? A lot of panic reactions are happening in newsrooms because the young ones have never experienced such a situation. There's another observation that I've made, and this also applies to European newsrooms, for example. Whereas 20, 25 years ago, we had a male dominance in the newsrooms, we now have in many newsrooms, also on the African continent, a female dominance. Now, generally speaking, one could say that this is a good thing because some analysis from a female point of view might be very interesting to the readership or to the media consumers. But at the same time, many of these women, they hit the glass ceiling at some stage. They cannot move on into positions of authority where editorial decisions are being made. That's another issue that I think is not good for the development of media, and it affects the credibility of the media as such. We need to talk more about quality in journalism in general. All the journalists amongst you in the room know this feeling that they are reading something or that they are viewing something and you think, no, this is not the kind of journalism that I stand for. This is not the kind of journalism that I'd like to pay for. And we are running a lot of discussions on the African continent with fellow editors-in-chief and publishers saying, I mean, if somebody who's running a car repair shop does an odd job and always steals the battery of your car or changes the engine with an old engine, you will tell your colleagues, you will tell your friends and say, don't bring your car to this repair workshop. If a doctor happens to be somebody who is not treating his patients in a proper way, his case will be brought to the attention of some medical control board at some stage. In journalism, we always shy away from naming the bad eggs and from explaining to the public that us as serious media, as quality media, as leading media, we like to set ourselves apart from the junk media that is out there. Many media houses on the African continent have developed quite a bit of creativity in finding new audiences. And the media program of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in Sub-Saharan Africa is quite proud that two of the most innovative media startups that were founded in Zimbabwe and in South Africa are partners of ours. The one is called 263 Chat. 263 is the country code of Zimbabwe, the telephone country code. And they are running online news on a website, but what they've also started doing is they distribute news to people who don't have very sophisticated smartphones. How do they do it? They do it by SMS. So they have these services not only in English, but in Shona, for example, one of the main language in Zimbabwe. And they are addressing issues that the people, especially in the rural areas, are concerned with. You know, like why have the prices for fertilizers gone up? When are the rains going to come? And so on and so forth. And they enrich that also with political news. The farmers don't get these SMSs for free. They have to pay something. It's the price of, for a month, it's the price of one print copy of the government newspaper. So it's a good deal for these people. Another possibility that explains the creativity is a WhatsApp newspaper called The Continent, which was founded in South Africa. It's distributed once a week by WhatsApp all over the continent. It now, meanwhile, has more than 100,000 readers on the continent. It's published in English. They have correspondence all over the continent. It's PDF paper of 32 pages, I think, which is being distributed and shared. So there are innovative attempts, which are also sometimes even profitable and can make money. I mean, the continent is getting being approached by big banks and by telephone companies like Vodafone and others that they would be very happy to pay for big advertisement campaigns in the continent. One other observation, I think, which is very important to make, which affects the credibility, and I have a lot of friendly arguments with many of our colleagues on the African continent about that, is that I think serious journalism, credible journalism, can show empathy with the disadvantaged, can show empathy with people who suffer in crises and all that. But journalism should not be activism. And we have a lot of media, small media NGOs and enterprises, also on the African continent, who might be funded by some benevolent foundations like the Open Society Foundation and so on and so forth, who are doing good work, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. But what happens is that the activism never turns into professional journalism. And I think serious journalism has to make that difference and has to explain there are these activists who write, and it's important that they write, but journalism that serves a gatekeeper function for the reading public and shows empathy at the same time is something different. And I would like to finally say that one development that we had to witness in the last 20 years, I don't know if it's the same in Bangladesh and in India, is that in Germany, but also on the African continent, we used to have these characters of publishers, gray-haired, predominantly men, but some women also, who were passionate about the journalism that was done in their media houses. And they would stand in front of their newsrooms when the censors would come or the secret police would come, or when the advertisers would say, if you're running that critical story about my company, I'm not going to advertise in your paper or on your television station anymore. There are still a few who are defending this serious journalism, but more and more of them are passing on, and more of the new publishers that we find are entrepreneurs, are people who invest into a media house they would invest into a juice factory or into a biscuit bakery. But I think we can all agree that that's a different thing from a media house. So finally, because my time is up, I do think that a lot of the financial and economic issues for the credibility crisis of the media can be addressed, but on the journalist side, there has to be a lot of soul searching, a lot of arrogance has to be shed, and a lot of humility has to take over to rethink that we are serving the audience. We are not serving our social media followership. We are serving the audience of those people who are reading the paper or watching the television news or are seeing the online news. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Plate, for your very interesting thoughts, and I have to hold myself back on following up on many things. We do that later. Last but not least again, Mr. Anam, I'm looking forward to your remarks.
Thank you. I would like to begin with a reference with Christoph, who said that there are not too many gray-haired journalists anymore, but it is both an asset and also a liability. Because with the digital media, you need much more, flexible brains. Sometimes experience is good, but that experience is old and it doesn't really suit. So it has to be a blend. And again, I would like to begin with a reference to Barkha, who's many, many years younger than me, but I admire her work. I'm a big admirer of hers. She doesn't know it. She asked the right question, that why is journalism for? Why do we become journalists? I think along the way, we forgot to ask this question. And not only we forgot, we deviated and we really went astray. And that is the reason for the credibility crisis. I think this crisis should be more and more looked at by the members of the profession itself. I think over the years, the print media particularly was really the centerpiece. Radio came, television came, but media, print media enjoyed the prestige. Now, over the years, few things happened. One is that we began to more and more pander to our advertisers. We forgot the readers and moved to the advertisers because they are the ones who gave us revenue. Secondly, over the years, we became arrogant. Instead of trying to tell people's story, we were telling them what we thought was the story they should know. Now, here is a bit of a problem also, that a serious journalism not only reflects what people think, but serious journalism also has a responsibility of saying things which may not be the most popular of the day. So therefore, we may not reflect the public, but we, in our serious, professional, ethical journalism, feel that it has to be said. Issues like racism, issues like religious bigotry, it is very popular, but to take a stand against it is sometimes going against the tide. Now, I say this every time I get a chance, that we journalists forget that judiciary and media are the only two institutions that are protected by constitutions of every democratic country. Now, why is that? Judiciary, you understand, they have to be independent. But why the media? The media is protected by the constitution because experience has shown that the government needs to be monitored. There has to be a watchdog in the society. Big corporations need to be monitored. And therefore, we are guaranteed by the Constitution. So when the society, when a nation through its Constitution gives my profession a special privileged position, then I owe it to the society to serve for its betterment. Now, coming to the present situation, the journalism, print, television, our business model has totally collapsed. And reason for it, again, I'm quoting Barkha, some of it is our fault, some of it is not ours. But I want to concentrate on our fault. We really slept on the job. We didn't, see, the social media is so much more democratic. It is so much more responsive to the public's wishes. So it has many, many virtues, but it has some very fatal flaws. It is a source of information which is unmonitored, unchecked. It is a source of information that is very individualized. So the individual's view gets up there in the net or in the digital platform without fact-checking. So while the social media has tremendous advantage, and it is really the most democratic form of news flow there is, but because it is unedited, because it is unverified, because it is personalized, gives us, the legacy media, an opportunity. And here is where we should work. I personally feel that the social media's age is going to end soon, in a sense that people will go to the social media for information, but over the years their experience will tell that whether I should believe what I read in the social media, I have to go to a credible media for verification. That is our opportunity. I believe that legacy media, if they can stick to their ethics, if they can embellish their professionalism, if they can really become better journalists, then in the coming few years, people will, yes, go to the social media for their first information source, but they will come to the legacy media, they will come to the credible media to verify what they have heard. So if we would like to have a future of our own, because as I said, the credibility we had lost because of many things. If we want to rebuild that credibility, now is the moment to really get serious in our jobs, ask the question that Barkha did, why are we journalists? Are we telling the story of the people, or are we telling the story of vested interests? If we can pass the next, I would say, 5 years with ethical journalism, then our days are going to be back. But to get our days back, we need to modernize. The way the newspaper, radio, television, the way it stands today needs to be modified. So for example, the Daily Star, which is the largest English language newspaper in Bangladesh, we are planning to become like a news platform, not a newspaper. So we'll be the news platform, and our messages will go out to the people through the print, through online, through mobile, and through multimedia. So we really have to now modernize and adopt these new technologies. And if we can do that successfully and always maintaining our ethical standard, then I think we have a very bright future. In the future, it will be a paywall-based sort of news platforms. The money people pay for buying one copy of Daily Star, they will be paying it online. And if we can do that, here again is a magnificent opportunity. Say, I'm talking about the Daily Star. If we can have subscription-based readership, say, for about 100,000, 200,000 people, that subscription will be enough for me to survive without advertisement. I will have great cost saving. I don't have to print it in the newsprint, which is very expensive. So I will save on the newsprint, I will save on the printing cost, and most importantly, I will save on the distribution cost. Normally, a newspaper is a 24-hour cycle. Today, the thirst for news is such that nobody wants to wait 24 hours. So Daily Star comes to their home every 24 hours. We'll have to be on the digital platform, coming to them every minute, updating the news. So the pattern will be this. In the morning, a reader will read the newspaper. Throughout the day, he will be with that same brand online, and till next day, they will again read the print. So this will be a 24-hour/7 cycle of a successful news platform. We need to go behind the paywall. So again, the future as I see it, that people will go to the social media for the first news. They will connect with the news through the social media. Then they will come to the legacy media for verification. So future successful media houses will have to be more analytical, because for the news, they're going to the social media. They will come to the established credible media for views, for analysis, for contextualization, and for opinion. So therefore, future journalists will have to be far more educated, far more well-versed in what's going on, and far more ethical. If we can do that, then we can re-establish the original motto that good journalism is good business. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Anam. And you already mentioned that the editor-publishers as gatekeepers for journalistic quality, which is very important, as we just heard from each of you, are somehow responsible for the credibility crisis of traditional media. So you as an editor-publisher, how are you ensuring that your journalists are reporting more balanced in the Daily Star?
Well, obviously, we are becoming much more stricter than we have been before. We are spending more money on retraining journalists. We are spending more money on sending them to foreign schools to update their educations. For example, my foreign editor, I will try and find out to send him or her to universities so that he updates his knowledge. And definitely, we have a fact-checking unit in the Daily Star than we had before. We have a code of conduct, which we didn't have before. Now we have. Much stricter journalism so that our credibility goes up. Seriously, credibility is the lifeblood of a media house. If you lose that, then you lose everything. Yes, I can pander to my advertiser, and I get more and more advertising, and I don't care what my readers or viewers think. Yes, that's the model, but that's not the model that I have dedicated my life for, and I'm sure Barkha, whoever asks the question, why are we in journalism, I think we'll really come back to the question of ethics.
Thank you. Ms. Barker, you answered this question when COVID started for yourself and changed your mode of work. And now your work is very much community focused. And how do you withstand external pressure by, you know, powerful individuals and also organizations, the government, business organization, to report or not to report on certain topics?
I just want to say that the point was made about journalism is not activism, and I'm so glad you made that point because it joins with the answer I'd like to give you on this question of withstanding pressure. I believe that if your work is sloppy in terms of not having, let's say, even reached out to the person that you're reporting on for a response, giving a right of response to, maybe you're doing a story on a corporation or an individual, and you don't give them the right to respond, right? Or you have not done your research, or you have not sort of followed journalism 101 practices, then actually you open yourself up to that pressure in a much more vulnerable way. So the point I'm trying to make is, historically, there have always been powerful people who have wanted to silence journalists, right? The best way to withstand pressure is to do robust journalism. And what I mean by that is, of course, there have been instances of perfectly honest, robust journalists having been silenced by sort of draconian laws, regulations, or rulers. Globally, we see this. But I believe that if you pretty much stick to the rules of your profession, it's very difficult, unless you sort of live in a country which has no democracy. That's a different scenario. I can't speak to that scenario. But in a scenario where you basically follow the rules of classic journalism, I don't think that pressure works. So I always tell my colleagues, I said, I'm ready to fight for a story with anybody powerful if we have done our job. But if we have messed up and I get a complaint and the mess up is ours, now maybe we're being picked on because someone doesn't like A or someone doesn't like B. But I have to be able to argue vociferously that we did what we needed to do. We were correct in our story. So let us first, much has changed, right? Technology, audiences, what people expect. But what has not changed is the gatekeeping that is needed before you put out a story. That has not changed. What was true 40 years ago remains true today. That have you given the person you are making an allegation against the right to respond? Have you spoken to more than one source? Have you cross-verified your documents? I mean, we're having a huge sort of debate in India right now between a media portal and Meta, the name of Facebook, over a story where the allegation that Meta is making is that the documents you've used to make an accusation against us are forged. So what I'm trying to say is we also live in a time where we have to cross-verify everything because things seem plausible. How many times has it been that we've seen a video online and we think it's plausible, but it turns out to be from 10 years ago, right? So my short answer to your question is, how do you withstand pressure? You withstand pressure by doing your job well.
Understood. Let me answer one more thing, and maybe you can answer I'm asking one more thing, and maybe you can answer very briefly on what you said in your presentation earlier, that you tried to, move away from your base readers, which is middle class. And how did you, at the end, make it happen and encourage also your normal readers to listen to your news stories?
I'll just modify that. I didn't try and change the demographics of my audience. I said that my challenge was, how did I make my audience interested in something that wasn't their immediate reality? That's a completely different question. My audience remains, although we've now gone into Hindi and we have a different class base also, but when we started, we had upper middle class Indians, English speaking mostly. And my challenge was, how did I make them care about something that wasn't their immediate reality? And it all goes back to the power of telling a good story, right? If I'm going to sit and lecture somebody and say, oh, how immoral of you. You're sitting and doing Instagram posts about banana bread while there's a poor migrant labor on the street without food. He or she is going to say, but that's not my fault. I didn't put them there. Why are you guilt-tripping me? So we cannot be guilt-tripping our readers, our viewers. We have to tell a good story. So it's the difference between, let's say if I did a story and I say 100 million migrant workers were impacted by COVID. I can tell you, nobody's going to care about the story. But if I tell you, if I bring to life, there was a man called Mukesh Mandal. He was 30 years old. He had 2 children. He was married to a woman called Poonam. He used to paint homes for a living. Then COVID struck and he lost every way of earning. He didn't have any assets. He only owned a phone. He sold his phone. What was the first thing you think he bought with that phone? He bought a fan and some rice. His wife was happy for a few days, but her happiness was short-lived. In next 2 days, her husband borrowed a sari from her closet, tied it to a pole and took his own life. Which story are you going to listen to? You might care about the second, you're not going to care about the first. It goes back to how you tell the story.
It all comes back to storytelling at the end.
It does.
Mr. Plate, you touched on the quality of journalism. And my question for you is that even if presidents now are spreading fake news, how can we actually make sure that users are also able to distinguish between the quality media and everything else that is out there, misinformation, propaganda, and fake news?
I think when quality media starts talking more about why they select this topic, why you tell that story, why you don't tell that story that everybody else is on social media talking about, it explains some of the criteria. The arrogance that I mentioned of journalists towards their audience should change to such an extent that we listen to the audience, that we start explaining why we do certain things, why we have certain opinions. And I do think that a lot has to do also with journalist training. A lot of young journalists that I meet these days, I was in Ethiopia the other day and I met these young journalists, and the majority of them, when you ask them, why did you choose journalism and why are you going to Addis Ababa University, it's pretty clear they want a quick path to fame. They want to be on social media, they have pretty faces, they want to be on television. A publisher friend of ours in Addis Ababa, he says that he's not hiring from the journalism academies anymore, because that's where many people go because they want this quick way to fame. I think we as experienced publishers or the director of the media program or senior reporter, we need to also talk a lot about the beauty that comes with journalism, the privilege that we are allowed to ask strangers questions that otherwise we would never dare to ask them. And by doing so, we can tell something about Bangladesh or about the reality in India and in many other places of the world. And I do think, coming back to your question of fake news, I do think that editors who take the liberty to say, I'm not going to publish this story because it's not verified, they are very often proven right a day or two later. We all know this pressure in newsrooms. I experienced it in a newsroom in Germany where junior reporters would say, but we have to run this story because the German press agency or Der Spiegel news magazine is running it. And then when you say, but I'm only going to run it once we have verified it, they look at you as if you are a loser, only to come back to you a day or two later to say, maybe you had a point there. I want to add one remark. because I'm coming back to finances. I think one big challenge for publishers, for foundations and others who are cooperating with media houses is to ensure not only good training, but an appropriate pay for reporters and others. We have examples on the African continent where media house owners don't pay their journalists. And they tell their television reporters, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, could you please then ask the person that you're doing the film about, or the portrait about, or the interview with, to pay you? I mean, that's a total perversion or corruption of the whole idea of journalism. But we have other examples. In Ghana, for example, where we have a publisher who's running a media house with radio and television, and he says, I want to pay my presenters and my reporters a salary that allows them to get a loan at the bank for a new car, which I think is an interesting or quite a good benchmark, which reduces the attraction of brown envelopes that become increasingly popular in journalism, where politicians and business people call for a press conference and put a brown envelope into the press folder. And maybe they call it lunch money or transport fees or whatever, but actually it's a bribe. And the only way to counter that and to increase or to improve journalism is an appropriate pay.
Thank you. And before I also want to open up the floor to the audience, I have one more question for all of you, so please also try to be short. You all mentioned earlier activist journalism, and I would like to bring it back to the ACPC, so political communication. And I'm certain everyone in the room and our panelists, you all have witnessed one way or the other of political parties instrumentalizing news and media institutions for political gains. Maybe the US, once again, is a good example for that. And since the media is the intermediary between politicians and voters, political parties, of course, should and need to make use of the media, so I'm in no way arguing against that. But what role did political activist reporting, like Fox News, for example, play in replacing factual and unbiased reporting that you all mentioned is so important, and how did that affect the credibility crisis that we're in at the moment? And maybe we start with you, Ms. Dutt.
I think can you all hear me? No. Can you hear me? Okay, wait, I have another one. Can you hear me? Yeah. I think this polarization that I made a reference to in the beginning, we don't talk often enough about. The toughest thing today for a journalist is to not be co-opted by an ideological camp. It's a very, very tough place because everybody judges you for being this or that, what they imagine you to be, if you resist being either. Now, by that, I don't mean that you're not honest to the facts of a story. You can't do both sidism if you can clearly see that something is happening. You can't pretend that you're not seeing it. But even in India, there is a kind of such a divide within media that before you see somebody, you know exactly what position they'll take on an issue. So there's no element of surprise left. There's no element of surprise left between an audience and the journalists that they are following. Now, not just are there all kinds of ethical questions that arise about bias, but also think, if we're speaking about effective storytelling, how boring is it to always know what somebody will say about an issue in advance, right? It's like watching a movie knowing the ending. I do believe that corrosive polarization has been very damaging to journalism, but it is easier said than done to kind of emerge from its shadows and break free from its shackles, because your audience today is also polarized in a similar way. And therefore, journalists who are not this or that, who are not Fox or MSNBC, let's take a global example, find it sometimes very isolating to be people who say, we are not going to be this or that. So you have to be willing to sometimes get fewer hits because you're not taking a side. The fact is that polarized media will have loyal audiences, but it won't be credible. That is the dilemma, the current challenge for journalists everywhere in the world. That you're almost expected to be biased by one or the other side. And if you are biased, you'll have loyal followers, but you will then be entering the terrain of political activism as opposed to journalism.
Very important points. Thank you for that. Mr. Anam, what's your take?
Before I answer this, I would like to refer to the previous question. Among the challenges that journalism faces, there are some new ones. For example, the brown envelope Christoph just mentioned. In addition to that, there are now what I would like to call activist investors. You know, they invest in a newspaper with the idea that that particular newspaper will promote his business, promote his political ideology, and that's the investment. And they're not really very concerned about how viable the business is. It's based on a subsidy model. You know, so the owner has 10 industries, and then he or she invests on a newspaper. It is factored in their PR budget. So every month, their salaries and everything will come. It's really not market-based or audience-based newspaper. We are also having now activist government. Before, government had their PR sections and all that, but now government instigates big businesses to start a newspaper so that that newspaper supports the government. Then there is the new laws. All sorts of new laws are coming up, which we never knew before. And the government is using the excuse of cyber security to make laws relating to the digital world, which they pretend saying that this is only for the cyber criminals. But in those laws, there are sections, there are articles that ultimately spill over to the media, because every media now has their digital presence. So maybe for the print, that law doesn't apply, but it applies to the digital platforms, which indirectly then affects the newspapers. So these are the new threats to journalism. Now, coming to the question of activism and professional journalism, for example, I would be a big activist for climate change issues. Now, this is not very popular with my audience, but me as a newspaper, realizing the enormity of the climate change, I would actually indulge in not activism, but proactive journalism by reporting stories which may not be otherwise there. I would be a bit of an activist in preventing child marriage in Bangladesh, which is a serious issue. So there are issues in which I think the editor or the editorial team must agree to do more reporting. Let's say normally I would not be writing so much reports on environment. Now in Bangladesh, it's a riverine country, rivers are being polluted. So I as an editor have decided that I'm going to run a series of stories and multimedia products on the pollution of rivers. This may not be the most popular topic, but I think it is my social responsibility. So activism versus professional journalism, where my social responsibility begins and where propaganda ends. I mean, these are very subtle but important distinctions. And as the editor or as the editorial team, we need to make judicious judgments on these issues. So I would not bracket saying that all sorts of activism I would not do in Daily Star.
Thanks so much. Mr. Plate, last but not least, before we open up the floor to the audience, what's your take on the question?
Well, the initial question was about politics and journalism.
Correct. Please answer on that only.
And I'd like to only briefly comment that because we, as a media program, we are also working in political communication. And of course, we always know that political journalism and politics have a symbiosis, and journalists and politicians, they do meet very often, and there's a lot of exchanges, there's a lot of debates, there's an exchange of ideas, sometimes there's even movement of personnel from one camp into another, from journalism into politics, or rather seldom it is vice versa. What I observe very often is that now working on both sides or working in political communication is that shockingly often do politicians or their teams rather not know how serious journalism works. And shockingly often do journalists not experience what immense pressures and dependencies politicians work and live under. And despite the fact that there are friendships across the line here and there, we are when we are doing political communication conferences on the African continent, we sometimes also invite journalists, or we invite a politician to a media conference, because I think it is very important to encourage this kind of exchange to increase the understanding of the immense pressures, for example, that the one or the other side is under. And I've observed here in Singapore at this ACPC that there was quite a lot of this exchange between politics and journalism, which I think is a very good thing to do, and I can only encourage all of us to support such kind of exchange.
And with these thoughts, I would like to open up the floor and take 3 questions at a time. I saw one over here, then Yin over there, and in the last row also.
Hi, Platter. This is Muqtadir from Bangladesh. I'm really appreciate your word, journalism is not activism. But in the time of social media and the time of global surge of opinionated idea, sometimes I get very confused between the difference of journalism and activism. Like when, for example, when the human rights issue is a very big concern in Bangladesh, when I ask the question to the minister or the person who is concerned about that, when I write about this, am I doing activism? Sometimes I become so, when minister in front of me and I asking a question repeatedly because he's not answering the question, am I an activist? So I'm sometimes really confused about this. I will appreciate if you answer how do I really differentiate this thing, because it turns sometimes that in personal my life, when I see something is not been reported in the mainstream media and I tweeted it on my Twitter, will I be considered as activist? Thank you very much.
Hello. Yeah, actually, I have 2 questions. And first question is similar to just now. Like, I think sometimes when a journalist, they report the facts, it's already an activist in some countries, especially in Asia, like China, something like that. So I think it's it's a problem. Like, we know that journalism shouldn't be activism, but then when you report the facts, when you go over the fact, you already become an activist. How can we address that? And the second question is, this panel, we focus a lot on the traditional journalism, but I think we can see a trend. There is like a decentralized trend. Like many journalists, they write their own stories, and then they put their stories on Patreon, and then people subscribe to those journalists, and so that they get paid directly from the readers. So I want to ask the panels, do you think this will be a solution for the traditional media, like what Mr. Platter said just now about underpay issues, will this be a solutions? And also, will this be a solution to have more trust in the media, or rather than it will be make more problems for the journalism? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I think there was one more question.
Hi, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Lance from the Philippines. Anyone from the panel may answer this question. There could be many factors why people seem to lose their trust in the media, or traditional media for that matter, and many would assert that this is because content creators online seem to be quote-unquote more credible and appealing to masses or the consumers. I'm interested to know your reaction on this, and as journalism and media practitioners, how do you change the narrative?
Thank you. Maybe we start with this question. Ms. Dutt, would you like to answer?
So I guess this is the challenge, right? You do not want to be disconnected from your audience, but you cannot be pandering always to the dominant narrative. In some ways, sometimes it's your duty to maybe place new facts before your audience, which may get them to challenge their own beliefs. So my answer would be that I think the best journalism is journalism that makes us, as its practitioners, question our assumptions, but is so effective that it can also make the audience question their assumptions. I think journalism must be a constant process of interrogating truths that are assumed, right? Now, this doesn't mean, I think somebody asked earlier that if I'm persistently asking a follow-up question, am I an activist? No, but you're an activist if you think that the job of your journalism is to make or break governments. Then you should be in politics. You're an activist if you won't put something that makes a political party that you don't like look good. You're an activist if you don't include something in your story that is inconvenient to your ideology, but you can see that it's true. So activist is not rigorous journalism. Activism is having your ideology take priority over what you see to be the truth.
Mr. Platter, then there was a question of Patreon and the change of journalism and how they publish their stories and whether that can be a success story. What do you think?
Sorry, I didn't get beginning. There was a question of?
About Patreon from Yin over here, who said that individual journalists are publishing their stories not with a traditional media house, but they go on a website, for example, such as Patreon, where you then have to pay to get access. So do you think that is a model for the future?
It is certainly an outlet for some journalists. I still believe very strongly that the traditional journalism, although the traditional journalism goes through a lot of changes, will remain the very important journalism, or the most important form of journalism. But I would like to add one thing when it comes to the media outlets. Where are stories being published? And that is very briefly that the publications we are talking about now, and we have to take that into consideration, are predominantly publications that can be afforded by the middle classes and by the elite, by the elites. How do we inform the masses of people in Asia and on the African continent in such a manner that they feel informed about the pandemic, about political developments? Now, we have seen in some countries the Free Basics initiative by Facebook, which gives a very, they were kicked out of India, but it gives a very limited access to selected information, which I think is not a solution. But I have a lot of hope in public service broadcasters, who have the advantage that they are free of charge to the public, that usually they cover the whole area of a particular nation. Now, we all know that many of the public service broadcasters have deteriorated into mouthpieces of the ruling party or the government, but they're still very well-trained journalists, and many of these broadcasters have a mission which is inscribed in the Constitution, and if civil society could push them more to actually serve the wide audience with quality journalism, I think a lot has been achieved.
Mr. Anam, I'm curious what you think about the question on when reporting becomes activism and how to distinguish the two.
It's a dilemma. I think the answer comes from the journalist himself or herself. If you are true to your conscience, if your whole motivation is based for public good, you are not following your personal prejudices or your own otherwise agenda, then go for it. Because it is really, sometimes you need to go for a story which is otherwise not very popular or not very well known, but very important. And for me, as I mentioned before, climate change, it's really not the most popular story for my readers. But I have to keep hammering at it because otherwise there is no future. Child marriage, women's rights, gender oppression. I mean, these are stories that society needs, and we journalists must tell it. I'd like to make one more point here is that, you know, the world needs good journalism, however we may be criticized. The future will need much more because it will be an information-based society. Digital information, whatever information you say, future is going to be so much more information-based. And therefore, future needs good journalism. And those of us who are in the profession, we should feel extremely proud that by accident or by choice, we have come to a profession that is extremely necessary for fellow human beings and for social progress. Without professional, independent journalism, we really have a bleak future.
Thank you. We have a few more minutes, and I would like to take one more round of questions. I already saw my colleague Mega over there, and then in the last row as well. Okay, I think I didn't overlook anyone.
So my question is to Barkha, but it's also the whole panel. I think in Asia we are seeing this like two kind of newspapers. One is pro-government and another is non-government, against the government. So, you know, when we read a newspaper, we read both the sides. But how do newspapers which are like not siding with anyone, or journalists like who are not siding, how do you all get the trust of the public? And what are the challenges?
Thank you. We take the second question first.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. My name is Duke from Indonesia. So we have, at least to my observation, two jobs here. The first one is to ensure that the media content free from disinformation, right, from the fake news and etc. But the other important thing, I guess, if we want good journalism, we have to think about how to fund the production of good journalism itself. In case of Indonesia, there is like a serious problem regarding following the COVID-19, where most of the commercial media, which traditionally produce good journalism, have a serious problem in accessing commercial advertisement. So they have to move to another option of funding, and there are a very limited availability opportunity of funding that might come from government, which is in a danger of political intervention, or they try to keep engaged with the audience. This is the hard thing to do. So I'm going to hear your opinion. What are the more possibility here to ensure that a traditional media, perhaps newspaper, or you mentioned about public service broadcasting, are still ongoing to produce good journalism within the condition of lacking commercial support and in a danger of government intervention? Thank you.
Thank you. Two very interesting questions. Let's start with the first one with Ms. Dutt on government and non-government reporting.
I mean, I think I kind of already referred to this. I don't believe in this kind of journalism. It is increasingly the sort of journalism we often see. I personally find it suffocating. And I do believe that if you choose to not be I'm not interested in pro-government, anti-government. I'm interested in, are you telling the truth or not telling the truth? And the truth is the best version that you're able to ascertain in a given situation in a limited amount of time. The truth also is not some noble, abstract thing that you are the arbiter of. You are simply in a circumstance where you tell the closest approximation to your understanding of what you believe to be true. Now, of course, the point has been made about child marriage, women's rights, climate change. There are certain things in which there is no other side. Everybody knows that. There is no other side. But there are other things. I mean, let me give you an example. We had a long farmers' agitation in our country where farmers were on the streets for more than a year opposing a particular legislation that the government wanted to bring. Now, I mean, there are people who feel very strongly that the legislation is good. There are people who feel very strongly that the farmers had a right. And, you know, I felt that I had to give equal space to both of those arguments, though there were colleagues who, because they may not like the government, will support and celebrate any protest against it. And then the vice versa is true. There are also colleagues that will not call out the government for any blatant wrong that is happening, right? So those things really bother me. But our challenge is, how do you get loyalty from an audience that is looking for confirmation bias? And my answer to that is, one, be authentic. I find that people may not agree with you. You don't need people to agree with you. You don't even need people to like you. You simply need people to watch your work or read your writing. And as long as they're not ignoring you, don't be in journalism to be popular. Just forget the popularity game. I always say, I don't care if you love me or you hate me. As long as you're not ignoring me, I'm doing my job, right? So don't look to co-opt your audience. Just look to be compelling enough in your work that they engage with you.
I think that would already be a very good closing statement, but I'm afraid we have to close the panel with a more difficult topic, which is money. So, Mr. Plate, how to fund good journalism?
Well, I know that there are many media enterprises in Asia, also in Africa, who get some kind of donor money. And I see the need that here and there that donor money might be necessary, but I can only strongly advise to diversify. I mean, to get support from as many different sources as possible, because we have seen many, many cases in which at some stage the donor and the editor-in-chief or the publisher, they fall out with each other, and then there's a problem. But not all is doom. I mean, the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us on the African continent, I mean, there was, in 2018, we organized a publishers conference in Accra, in Ghana, and all the publishers there from 20 African countries, they said, a paywall in Africa, it never works, because people like to take stuff for free. And when they have expired their 10 free articles on this device, they go onto their son's device, and so on and so forth. We know the same discussion from Europe. We had it a couple of years ago. The pandemic came, and we observed that at least in Anglophone Africa, not so much in Francophone Africa, which is half of the continent, the growing middle classes had such a desperation for verified, serious news that they realized you have to pull out your credit card from time to time and pay. Now, there are some important papers in South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya who have introduced a paywall. That's number one. Number two, which is a very good African concept. I don't know how good it works in Asia, but I could imagine it also works, is tap the diaspora. There are hundreds of thousands of people from Zimbabwe, from Nigeria. Half of Silicon Valley is populated by wealthy Nigerians. Tap them. Work on their homesickness. Ask them to support your paper. The same is being done in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Niger, where publishers are tapping the diaspora. The diaspora in Europe, in Canada, and the US, they want to know whether the new mosque around the corner from grandmother's place has now been built or the supermarket has been opened, what the local government elections, what results the local came out of the local government elections. That's another opportunity. So I think creativity and diversification. Get your funding from as many different sources as possible. And don't consider making money with good journalism as a sin. It is not a sin to make money with good journalism.
Thank you. And Mr. Anam, you have the pleasure to have the last words on this panel on funding and everything else.
On donor funding of the media, I'm fundamentally against it because ultimately it discredits the media itself. So donors should fund issues of press freedom, of whatever, fund issues, not institutions. And on the journalism thing, I would appeal, I will conclude with an appeal to the audience, to the readers, the viewers, that please make a distinction, a conscious distinction of media institutions who are trying to be authentic and who are being propagandist. Now that is a responsibility you have. But as my message to my fellow journalist is, stay the course and the future is ours.
Wonderful. So, Ms. Dutt, Mr. Plate, Mr. Anam, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. It was a great pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.